Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Plenary 8 of the Global Philanthropy Forum Conference. This one is on promoting good governance. My name's Elizabeth Farnsworth. I'm a documentary filmmaker, and I'm a correspondent with the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer, and it's my great pleasure to be here with this very eminent panel. In discussion after discussion today, and yesterday, and the day before, examples have surfaced which illustrate the importance of good governance. Yesterday, you may have heard Zainab Salbi discuss women in Iraq joining fundamentalist groups because the groups are providing food, jobs, health care, which the government is not. In Judy Woodruff's discussion yesterday with Fazl Hassan Abed and Larry Brilliant, the need for stability was mentioned again and again. And today, many of you may have heard Roshana Zafar say that in Pakistan, she can provide about 325,000 women with microcredit, but 12 million need it. And she said there'd been a missing link in the conference. How can we make governments do these things that we're all talking about? This panel will explore philanthropy's role in building state capacity and promoting good governance. I don't have to tell any of you that malgovernance, corruption, and weakened repressive state structures can bring increased vulnerability to conflict, to human rights abuses, and to the presence of crime syndicates and terrorist activity. A government with strong state structures and respect for rule of law has a better capacity to attract investment and encourage active and participatory civil society. How can philanthropists and donors most effectively promote good governance? Our panelists, I hope you'll all read their bios in your programs, because if I could take the knowledge and experience these gentlemen have, we could spend the whole day, the rest of the day and the evening, hearing stories from them. K.Y. Amoako is president of the African Center for Economic Transformation, a nonprofit based in Accra, Ghana, and former executive secretary of the UN Economic Commission for Africa. Ashraf Ghani, on the other end, is chairman of the Institute for State Effectiveness and former finance minister of Afghanistan. He's the author of Fixing Failed States, a framework for rebuilding a fractured world. With Claire Lockhart, he wrote that book. It's an Oxford University Press book that's just out in the last couple of weeks. And in the middle is Kumi Naidoo, who's Secretary General of CIVICUS, the World Alliance for Citizen Participation. It's a global network of civil society organizations with programs committed to promoting civic engagement and civic expression in 110 countries. He's also the chair of the Global Call to Action Against Poverty. Let's start with some definitions. Dr. Amoako, what is good governance? Why should it matter to this audience? What's at stake?
Thank you. Good governance, especially in the African context, is critical to almost everything we do. I spent 10 years as head of the Economic Commission for Africa in Addis Ababa. And at the very outset, that was in the 1995, we did realize that Africa was undergoing a major transition, and the issues of governance were at the centerpiece of all that. And I remember going to the UN and presenting my budget to the Fifth Committee, and I had a program promoting good governance in Africa. And I ran into a lot of flack. Because the view then was that governance was political issues, and good governance was something that was being used to hit upon the head of African governments for democracy and all that. So we had to define governance a bit more broadly as at the core of social and economic development. So we came out an analytical framework with 4 characteristics of what good governance means. The first is that good governance or promoted governance means in a society develop a capable state, a state where you enable peace and security to prevail. Second characteristic of the capable state that promotes good governance is to promote an enabling environment for political and legal framework that will allow economic growth and the broad sharing of the fruits of growth. A capable state is also, in my view, where the private sector, enabling environment, allows the private sector to promote growth, jobs, and incomes for the people. And finally, at the core of all that, it seems to me, is policy and political stability, and a consistent and fair applications of the rule of law. So to me, good governance is about creating a capable state and building the institutions and the capacity that will allow these things to prevail.
Okay,
so that's my definition.
Let's keep going with definitions. We're going to get very soon to how you all might be able to contribute to this. But Ashraf, Ghani, what's at stake here? Add to the definition what you think is the meaning of good governance, but then tell us what's at stake here.
Well, first, we have three types of governance that need to be differentiated. There's the governance of the market, and this has been usually associated with spontaneity, and that's false. The market needs to be governed. There's the governance of networks. That is much more a voluntary set of agreement on a set of rules.
What kind of networks?
Like the philanthropy. $150 billion, 60 corporations. How that money is put or not put into effect is going to have enormous consequences. Third is governance of hierarchy. State is one form of hierarchy, and the state needs to be subject to rules, processes, accountabilities, and freedoms, because you need to bring this together. At the core of governance are citizens. Let me use two metaphors.
But let's stay with the state governance,
Yes,
just for now, because what's at stake if this doesn't happen? You've just written a book about failed states, for example.
But let me take a metaphor and a proverb and then illustrate it. The metaphor is called Baghdad. You know, what it literally means is the garden of justice. In 1,500 years ago, it was the site of what was called the circle of justice, prior to the advent of Islam. And it said, justice is fundamental to production. Production is fundamental to having an army. An army is central to keeping order. And at the root are the people. In the Near East, the tradition of good governance has been characterized by people are the root and the government is the tree. And if the root is not firm, the tree withers away. The other is this proverb from Native Americans. It says the earth is not what our ancestors hand over to us, but what we borrow from our children. So at the core is how we manage for the future, that we have two sets of responsibilities. One in terms of what we've acquired, and here, the 19th century view of the state with which we still operate is based on violence. The new social contract has to be around delivery of core services to citizens. State failure is marked by failure to deliver these sets of rights and obligations, and state success is marked. Take infrastructure in the United States. The government of the United States gets a C- to D on management of infrastructure. In that regard, it's a failure. Take the governance of internet, it's a remarkable success because the communities came together. Take spectrum, it's an enormously complicated set of issues where we are not creating the freedoms for common. But at the core, what we need to really understand is that the risk, whether it's the aid system or philanthropy, needs to be catalyst for a relationship between citizens and their governments in terms of accountabilities that do not substitute for them, but make the state responsible.
Mm-hmm. Just before, very briefly, because I want to get to Kumi Naidoo, explain what you just said.
What I'm saying at the heart is the following. If we take the metaphor that people are the root and the government is the tree.
About not substituting.
Substituting is when you try to do the work. The NGOs try to substitute for the state. We have 20 years of experience. It hasn't worked any single place. You've failed to scale up. I mean, time and again, we're coming to the same thing. You know, small is beautiful, but it is not going to solve the fundamental problems of poverty. Let me illustrate.
No, I'm going to go to Kumi Naidoo now.
Yeah.
Dr. Naidoo, you've had experience, extensive experience, both at the grassroots. I mean, this is what you do, this is what you've done all your life, but also you've had the experience where it's not enough. Explain, and then let's begin telling people what they might do.
I'm reminded of a moment during the liberation struggle in South Africa. If you're the last person answering the same question, you started by saying, most of the really good points have been made by the other speakers. And then you said for emphasis, and then you spoke for about 3 hours. What I would add...
I won't let you, don't worry.
Yeah, that's fine.
Good try.
What I would add is that, to put it simply, in 20, 30 years ago, when we spoke about governance, we understood governance to mean what government did. Today, when we talk about governance, we're also talking about a multi-sectoral approach to addressing the challenges that face humanity. Government on its own cannot address and meet all the challenges that humanity faces. Certainly, as Ashraf points out, NGOs, given the scale at which we operate, cannot actually provide the impact that is necessary, and even enlightened business cannot. So today, the only thing I would add to my definition of governance is that good governance also must include specifically a protection for human rights, a serious commitment to gender equality, because we live in a world today where gender equality we talk about all the time. The reality is there are more women than men on this planet, but if we look at governments that promote good governance in theory, the fraction of women that participate is still highly, highly underrepresented. But the choice for philanthropy and philanthropists is how do you understand how change happens? And today, what you are seeing, if you take an issue like domestic violence, for example, most of the investment of philanthropy will go at the delivery micro level. It's important, providing shelters, providing refuges, providing counseling, and so on. However, if tomorrow Father Christmas came and multiplied the budgets of every foundation and every NGO by 5,000% to work in, say, domestic violence, we would go from addressing this number of people that are affected to this number of people if we think that's going to solve the problem. Unless we ask ourselves the question about what is the gap at the middle, what are the policy deficits that leave so many women vulnerable, and unless we start investing in ensuring that we have domestic violence acts, for example, ensuring that the policies that govern the way business, police and other parts of government operate with regard to women who are survivors of violence and so on, we do not get so far. So my message to the philanthropy community is simply this. There's a thin line between philanthropy and philanthropy, F-O-O-L-A-N-T-H-R-O-P. If we think that we will get sustainable, lasting solutions to all the issues we've heard about here by solely putting resources for quick returns or a magic bullet in terms of delivery, you're fooling yourself and you're fooling the people that you're supporting. You have to recognize that real change and sustainable change is a marathon, not a sprint. And that's why investing in policy changes and governance changes to ensure that those solutions are lasting and sustainable is critically important. And I'm not saying you shouldn't put money into delivery, but if you fail to invest in the other two areas, you are fooling yourself that you are really contributing to change.
All right, so let's do... Let's get some more specific examples now. Dr. Amoako, how do you do that? How do you fund the sorts of things that you've all said must be funded? And where have you seen good examples of this?
Let me start with the first point in terms of where do you start, and build upon what Kumi just said. It's about institutions, it's about people. And promoting governance, I think we all agree on the importance of state effectiveness and all that. But promoting good governance means building the capacity. And building capacity means people. It's about people who have to be trained, who have to be well equipped, who have to be adequately remunerated and compensated, and who also have to be appropriately disciplined in the use and management of state resources, okay? So that's where philanthropists can come in. And let me give you a very concrete example. Take Liberia today. What's happening in Liberia? In terms of Liberia, it's a country that we all know has suffered so much. Institutions have been totally destroyed. You have a president who goes in highly respected, well-loved by everybody. What situation does she face? How does she move this society from where she is? She has no people. She has no institutions. Here's a country where the total budget in the first year was only $149 million. Here's a country that was in arrears $3 billion. The international institutions were frozen. Because of the arrest, they couldn't come in. She didn't have people. The first thing she did was she found some Liberians from the diaspora, from the World Bank, like a former finance minister, who went in to become her finance minister. She brought in somebody. She didn't even have money to pay them. She had to come out with a program of a vision of a strategy for moving the country forward. She didn't have the people. Stepped in right away some philanthropists, like George Soros. Says, hey, here's $5 million, right? Then Scott brought in some people to help, and so over the last year, she has relied. So she's come up now with a poverty reduction strategy, an excellent, where the 4 pillars are exactly what we're talking about now. A, peace and security. Train the police, train the soldiers. C, economic revitalization. Get the economy going, get jobs to the people. Rule, the third pillar is promoting good governance and the rule of law. And then the fourth pillar is, has to do with economic rehabilitation and infrastructure. But the point I'm trying to say is that without the kind of support she got initially from philanthropists who can move very, very, very fast in terms of the policy analysis and the capacity building, and now that then she's trying to rationalize a relationship with an international institution so they can come in and support. So basically, that's a concrete example of the way that
it's a good example, I think.
We can move on.
Dr. Ghani, examples?
Well, examples range. Singapore, the southern states of the United States in the last 40 years, Ireland, Spain. These are
Singapore, the southern states, Ireland, Spain.
Ireland and Spain. In Chile could be taken as other examples.
Philanthropy helped with some of these cases.
These are places that exactly resemble Liberia or Afghanistan, etc. of today.
Talk about the southern states.
Well, the image, a dog unleashed upon children that want to go to school. Governor Wallace declaring segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. Today, the southern states of the United States have 91% of the income of the northern states, and in terms of purchasing power, it's greater. North Carolina is the best business climate in the entire country. Georgia, if it were an independent country, would be the 17th largest economy in the world. It's a remarkable transformation in terms of investment, and 3 things have been critical. Infrastructure, investment in infrastructure, investment in people, and partnership with the private sector. That story of transformation is a remarkable story because there's an adage that we don't know what to do. We have an enormous knowledge. And in terms of philanthropy, Spain really stands out probably as the most remarkable example. There's a corporation, a lot of you know it probably as Mondragon. Mondragon began by a Spanish priest as an act of building war-torn Spain. And it generated a remarkable example, and that's the type of model that needs to be followed. Because the first phase was redistributive, actually reaching out to the poor. But the second phase was to create wealth and not remain. Ireland today is going to be spending 50 billion euros in the next 4 years on social protection, on youth, on the elderly. And Ireland was the basket case. All of these have involved distinctive patterns of transformation, and I think it is really important to be able to build on them. If you take the case of Afghanistan, I confronted this when I went back after 24 years. What do? The thing that is most important is to put the rules of the game into play. I'll just give 2 illustrations very quickly. Telecom. We had 100 mobile phones in July of 2002. We have 4 million phones and the largest taxpayer in the country. It's all how transparently you manage the process and how you set the playing field. 2, rural development. We created a program called National Solidarity. It's covered 70% of the villages of Afghanistan. Each village has received between $20,000 and $60,000. And they now make the decisions because they're citizens. In the past, NGOs used to come and bring them the beams that didn't fit their roofs. And they literally burned them. One has to be able to have a different view of governance. Governance is not central government. It is across levels of a society, And we need to be able to create collective power, which is mutual accountability. Because if we again take a top-down authoritarian view, it is not going to work in today's circumstances.
Kumi Naidoo, let's stay with examples, because I think they're very illustrative for people here. And how does this relate to the people here who are trying to decide where to put their money, whether it's $50,000 or $50 million?
Okay, 3 additions to my colleague. First, picking up on Ashraf's last point, that governance is not only at the national level, but also at the provincial or state and local level. But also, when you're thinking about where you can invest, you also need to recognize that the slogan that was operative in the early 80s, think globally, act locally, has now have to be flipped upside down, because increasingly, even if you have good, anti-corrupt, efficient governments in developing countries, they cannot make progress around trade because that is outside of their domain of control at the national level, because these are decisions being made at the global level. Even if you take an issue like HIV/AIDS, the pricing of life-saving drugs is not happening at the national level, it's happening through global processes. So today, when we think about good governance, we have to be thinking about governance from the local to the global level, and institutions like the World Bank and IMF, as many of you are US citizens, have a stake in. I don't know whether you know that the World Bank preaches good governance in the world, but is one of the most badly governed institutions in democratic terms. You have to, and sorry, I'm not making it as a cheap comment, right? But I don't know whether you know, in your name as American citizens, the president of the World Bank has to be an American citizen, and it is governed on a $1, one vote basis, which means that poor countries have hardly any voice in an institution where most of the decisions affect their lives. So we have to address the issue of global governance as well. The second issue is about strengthening the space for civil society, because civil society is become a jargon now that everybody uses. I say today the president of the World Bank or the Secretary General of the UN can't give a major policy speech without the term civil society speeding off their tongues at the speed of a Boeing 747. However, the reality is, because of the way in which the war on terrorism has been waged, we are seeing governments shrinking the space of civil society in country after country after country. I've just come from Ethiopia, where 2 of my colleagues have spent 2.5 years in prison, who have been leading the equivalent of the ONE campaign or the Make Poverty History campaign in Ethiopia. We have not heard much opposition to that, even though we lobbied the US government, the EU, and so on. And yeah, I think when we're thinking about good governance going forward, we have to ask ourselves the question, how strong is democracy, or how real is democracy? Because democracy is central for good governance. If we don't have a genuine democratic ethic that we protect, we undermine it. And I would want to suggest to you, as I said to John Ashcroft in a debate at the World Economic Forum 3 years ago, the real test of democracy is not whether we can avoid torture, detention without trial, racial and religious profiling, and other undermining of human rights when there is no threat. The real test of democracy is whether we can hold true to those values when there are real or perceived internal or external threats. So one of the challenges I would make to you as philanthropists is that you, and as US citizens, is to recognize that if you cannot ensure that your government acts in a way that it genuinely, consistently upholds human rights and good governance, you make our work in the developing world immensely more difficult to convince our governments to do the right thing, because they can point to George Bush and says, he's doing waterboarding, so it's okay for us. So,
okay, I'm going to end this at the end with some more very specific advice, I hope, for all of you. But now that we're on the international aspects of this, let me also ask Dr. Amoako, what other international players are influencing good governance in the world?
Well, I think we've talked a lot about the international institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, the global players and all that. I think in the context...
About China?
About China. I think that's a very good question now. I mean, China, I think, look, I think the China situation has been, there are various ways of looking at it. And a lot of the focus obviously has been on the egregious type of behavior that people see coming from China, the extractive industries, the fact that they go in and make these huge deals with governments, the fact that they are propping up, perceived to be propping up autocratic regimes and all that. But I think when you go down and look at it more broadly, I think it's a lot more complex. For us in Africa, I think it's about how do we take advantage of the opportunities that China provides, but at the same time, being aware of the challenges and the difficulties and how we confront them. China, it seems to me, has about 3 broad interests in Africa, and that's basically for almost every superpower. They have a commercial interest, they have obviously political interests, and they have also interest in aid and investments and all that. And when you look at that, you see that, especially if you take the commercial interest, they are a buyer, they are a supplier, and they're also a provider of services. And in each of these areas, there are certain difficulties that we have to confront. Take, for example, the question of China as a supplier. On the positive side, China is providing a lot of cheap goods, consumer goods that obviously African countries perhaps can afford. But at the same time that you're providing these cheap goods, you have the situation where African industries are facing huge challenges in terms of moving up the value chain and all that. So these are issues that we have to confront. But also on the African side, I don't think it's a question of one size fits all. We have about 4 different situations in Africa that are dealing with China. You have the countries in crisis, clearly. Sudan, Zimbabwe, these are sort of pariahs in the international community. They can go to China, they don't care whatever anybody says, and get what they want from China, like Mugabe would do. Then you also have the countries in, say, emerging out of conflict, like the Liberians and all that, that also have to sort of, they see a value in China. China can come in and very, very quickly provide services, rules, and all that without all these conditionality. So how do you play that? And at the other extreme, you have countries like South Africa that are very, very strong by and large, can step up to China and have sort of their own independent positions. So the point I'm trying to say is a very complex mix of issues, and each African country will then have to decide its strategies, its options. And the thing that bothers me a lot, because African countries will be so small by and large, say Niger dealing with China or Mali dealing with China. The question is, how can we bring regional approaches to bear? How can we then use our institutions, regional institutions, to deal with China in that sense? But each African country will have to. So the sense that I want to, it's a very, very complex equation we have on the table. It's not just about human rights, it's broader economic issues, interface, debt issues, all sorts of issues, and then the question of coming up with the appropriate strategies, and every country will have to face up. And some of the work we're doing currently is to help some African governments come up with answers to this. Yeah.
I was struck in the human rights panel yesterday when the discussion turned to the human rights networks that have been born and developed so richly in the last years. And I want to ask Ashraf Ghani now, is there any network of groups dealing with questions of good governance that people here can plug into? And are there any specific organizations that you think are working best on these matters?
Well, it's really a tragedy. I mean, the World Bank has been in business for 60 years. It still does not have a manual on how to run a Ministry of Finance. I'm helping them prepare that manual, hopefully, because as Minister of Finance, I asked 2 questions. What should the Ministry of Finance do? What should it not do? The World Bank and the IMF took 6 months and couldn't answer me the question. That's why I looked at Singapore and Spain and all these other places. Talk of good governance pervades every place. Practice is sadly lacking because of 2 things. One, there's a technical assistance industry. Africa alone receives $4 billion in technical assistance to hire 100,000 people who I think don't do anything. They write 1,200 reports from Tanzania alone to the donors. So this is one part. Where good governance is really taking place, a lot of the inventions are in the market. And it's important, for instance, to realize, in the next 20 years, world at large, we are going to be spending between $24 and $43 trillion on infrastructure. New financial instruments are being put to make this realized. In India alone, 150 billion have to be raised during the next 5 years through infrastructure funds. So the key to this is to bring together variety of private sector, philanthropy, public sector. One role that is extremely important.
But if somebody here wants to be part of that or to do that, who do they go to? Who do they call? Go ahead, and then Kumi, I'll go to you.
With a lot of due respect, neither the United Nations, nor the World Bank, nor the IMF is the center. There are very good initiatives in Africa. YK's Places is one of those that needs to be.
What is one?
Dr. Amaako's
Yes.
Places is one of them. There are regional networks that are far more important. But if one really wants to discover good governance, it's Spain and Singapore and Dubai ports. It really is sectoral at this moment. The global knowledge has not been put together in a way that is convincing and agreed upon. OECD is probably the best network on governance. They're beginning to function, work on a project called Government at a Glance. But it's confined to OECD countries around 10 key variables.
Dr. Naidoo.
The key value of NGOs and civil society organizations is that because we are not weighed down by the bureaucracy of the state, we can actually innovate, take risk, and come up with innovative models and solutions which we need government to take to scale. So I think when we're looking at resources to invest in right now, I don't think I agree that we should not be thinking about trying to fund the World Bank's anti-corruption program or so on. But I think we have to support organizations like KY's here. We have to look, in fact, if you're talking about corruption specifically, the fight against corruption is being driven outside of government. Transparency International is a global network that is just about 12 years old. It's done amazing work. I have the privilege of chairing the board of an organization called Partnership for Transparency Fund that gives small grants to civil society organizations fighting corruption at the local level. And yeah, when we think about corruption, I just want to use, there's one thing that has troubled me throughout this conference, which I just want to clear off my chest. And that is, quite often when we talk about Africa, we talk about Africa as a basket case and a desperate case and so on. The one thing I think you need to understand, that Africa is one of the richest continents underneath the ground, and that is precisely why we are one of the poorest continents above the ground. Because the resource richness of Africa is what has led to massive corruption and so on. But again, the choice for philanthropy is when you're thinking about how you can contribute to fighting corruption, you've got to recognize that there's petty corruption and there's mass scale corruption. Petty corruption is when a police officer stops you on the street and says, give me $10 and I'll let you go. Now that's bad, it should be stopped. But that kind of corruption circulates within the country. It doesn't leave the country. Now I'm not endorsing it, I'm just saying that it doesn't have the issue of capital flight. The real story about corruption is that our leaders on the continent would not be able to engage with mass scale corruption were it not for the collusion, the indifference, and the involvement of Western governments, Western corporations, and Western interests. So therefore, when you think about where you invest in terms, is also about trying to improve the accountability of your own corporations here in the US and your own government. Because when you have, for example, Dick Cheney's Ali Burton getting a no contest big grants to provide things in Iraq, billions and billions of dollars, and then overcharging, when we go to our government and say, you have to do things on proper tenders and transparent things, they say, well, you know, if Dick Cheney and George Bush can do it, why can't we do it?
And staying with this question, Dr. Amoako, about networks of support and actual specific organizations weighs into this. Good examples?
Well, I think he mentioned Transparency International, which is a clear case of an organization, and I was with Peter Hagen when this whole concept of Transparency International came up, and I think it's been a major, major force. I think within the African continent also, there are institutions clearly that need to be supported. There's Trust Africa, for example, that's just coming up with some funding from Ford Foundation. I think my own organization, what we're trying to do is bring African leadership together around the issues of transformation, around the issues of management of natural resources, drawing lessons from each other. So I think there are all these institutions coming in. But if you don't mind, I want to go back to a really practical issue. that we do face, and perhaps have a dialogue with you as to some of the things you can do. And again, let me take Liberia, because I really believe in concrete cases. And I start off by saying, here's the situation, here's a government that goes into power, everything is broken down, they cannot get money from the international community because of arrests and all these things. Philanthropy goes in and helps. Makes a difference. I can assure you, if you ask Ellen Johnson Sirleaf today, she say she has managed to move her country, at least where she has a vision, with capacity, with support from philanthropy. Otherwise, she will not be there. A lot of philanthropists are going into Liberia today because of what that country means to the US. So you have people going to talk about the Clinton Foundation is there, health sector, people going church groups.
And they're going because they think they trust your government.
Yeah, they trust the government, and they think they can do something.
You trust her.
But that's a start. Yeah. Well, okay. And she has some competent people around her, so okay. But yeah. But the issue that she and the philanthropists are facing right now is, how do you marshal or harness all these goodwill? Where do you start? There's no coordination. All the coordination in terms of aid flows are among the big players, the donors and all that. Philanthropy is outside. That's group, and some of them are frustrated. Where can we bring in money? So one of the conversations we've had with the president and the government, should we create a forum where you bring, some of the real philanthropists who are interested in a more coordinated fashion? Yesterday, Librarian was talking about the SMEs, and that was music to my ears. Because to me, in terms of the growth and the small and medium enterprise sector, and a lot of them are going there wanting to help. Very good. So we still don't have a framework in the sense, and the government as such, I don't know what your example has been, Ashraf, in Afghanistan. How do you channel some of these resources in such a way that it meets the government's priorities and it can do a lot of good?
In fact, you talk about this in your book, that doesn't exist, that it's too disorganized, all of this.
Well, the first point is, again, power of rules.
Again,
Power of rules. The aid community is incapable of coordinating itself.
Sure.
That's the simple truth. So what did I do first? I said, no donor could be in more than 3 sectors, because they spread small sums of money all over, you can't measure the results. Second rule, fee for entry to each sector was $30 million. If they didn't give me $30 million for a sector, that was it. And everything got sorted. Third, I said 14 sectors. And
so
I
in this
banned
case,
the word
the
strategy.
means of organization was a very strong vision, in this
Because
case
you
from
have
you.
to-
Did
you
you
have
try to
to-
impose any kind of organization on them so they would?
I did, yes. Absolutely.
Did they meet together?
They had to, but it took, the price was 60% of my time as Minister of Finance was spent coordinating the donors. I worked 16 hours a day, 7 days a week, except for being in the hospital. And pro bono, because if I were paid by them, they would have run me. I resigned both from the World Bank and the UN to work in the Afghan government pro bono. But the minute I left, they broke down the structure of coordination. And the example is, one firm, American firm, was totally incompetent. I fired 60 people from them and technical assistants. And the minute I left, they were given a contract of $250 million. So the point that is being made here, corruption is a network. It's a global network of reinforcing mutual ties. If we want good government and good governance, the first thing we need to sort out is the aid system and its complications. Unless we sort out the aid system, the other side does not sort. Second is extractive industry. One of the most important initiatives today, both regarding Africa, Latin America, and Central Asia, is the extractive industries initiative. Unless money from extractive industry comes on budget and gets disclosed to the population, and here, the earlier panel to build on it, we have a remarkable capability now to disclose information. But governance historically has been about hoarding information and hiding information away from the population. We need to bring the power of technology, from the cell phones to the internet to others, to really disclose. This is a fundamental basis for citizenship rights. And in that regard, one instrument that is looked upon technical is critical. Everything has to be in one budget. As long as you have 20 different parallel systems, you are not going to establish accountability. Trade-offs between civil society, business, and government is to take place around the same table so mutual accountabilities can be built. Then we can deliver something to the citizens. Otherwise, a lot of nice slogans. We feel remarkable when we go to these conferences because we all reinforce each other's values. The sad reality remains that the day we leave, the reality remains till our next conference, and then we again start again. And we have to begin in different ways and have a much more cumulative set of results.
Okay, this sets us up perfectly for questions from you. Thank you all. I'm going to thank you more formally at the end. This is now the time for you to ask questions. Raise your hand, please. A Global Philanthropy Forum staff member will come to you with a microphone. Please state your name and affiliation. Keep questions and comments concise to allow as many of you as possible to speak, and do let us know to whom you are addressing your question. Yes, over here.
Hello, my name is Juan Dumas. I come from a Latin American NGO, and I believe this is from a philanthropist point of view, I guess, this is a very difficult issue to fund or to support. It is all about marathon process. It is not as fancy as technology. It is not as tragically striking as what Julia or Annie have shown us. Yet it is critical to all of those other things, right? To the success and scalability of those things. So my question to you is, where are the good practices in philanthropy regarding long-term commitment, flexibility, and kind of complexity to address the governance issue?
Do you have a certain person to whom you're addressing the question?
Kumi, please.
Yeah, just building on the comments earlier, the critique that was made of the aid system, you know, and that's really looking at US aid and governmental aid and World Bank aid, mainly in your comments. One of the things we have to look at is how much is that problem also applicable in the way the revenue flows from the foundation community is to the partners on the ground. I always say that the word partners right now is one of the most used, but also one of the most abused words in our world, because partnership assumes a certain level of balance of power and so on. So the challenge, I think, for philanthropy right now is to also look at how you can harmonize your work that you're doing. Because see, one of the big problems...
But are there some good practices you can recommend?
Well, there are attempts. The Council on Foundations and the European Foundation Center have been working to develop guidelines for good ethical practice at the global level. I think it's still early work in the sense that we have not yet moved as far as we can, but where there are good examples we can look at is where foundations do not go it alone, where they look at whether there are other foundations interested in that same area, they come around the table and they say, rather than that poor little NGO in Africa having to report to 6 of us separately, if we got together and we developed a consortium and had one funding agreement, it reduces the transaction cost. So there are several examples like that exist, and those are the things we need to build on. But I have to say that this is a challenge that the time is right to talk about, because I think there's lots more that you can do in your own work to make the transaction costs of your support to NGOs and other organizations in Africa and elsewhere in the developing world easier for them to manage their relationships with you. Because you can imagine people are spending huge amounts of time sending the fundraising proposals and then preparing 25 different reports in 25 different formats. One of the recommendations that I've been unsuccessfully trying to advocate in the US for some time is if all the foundations got together and agreed a joint fundraising application form and a joint fundraising reporting format, do you know how much of effectiveness that will actually contribute?
Now we're getting really specific. Another question. Yes, over here.
My name is Barbara Briggs-Letson. I'm with Jade Tree Foundation. I don't have a question. I just wanted to say that there is a very small organization called Grant Makers Without Borders that that is working very hard on best practices, and that might be a resource for everyone here. Thank you.
Good to know. Yes, right here.
I'm Monique Beadle with Human Rights USA. This is a question for Dr. Naidoo. I work with an organization that's founded on the principle that if the United States doesn't get human rights right, we can't expect other countries to follow suit. And you talked a bit about that. Can you give us some specific examples of ways that our loss of credibility has affected either attempts to implement human rights abroad or ways that other countries have followed some of our more despicable practices and followed suit?
Well, we could be here for the next 5 hours. But my short answer is firstly that the premise that you started with. I do not accept from the Zimbabwean government or the Russian government or the Ethiopian government that saying that things are bad in the US is an excuse to actually do. I think it doesn't help, but you know, two wrongs don't make a right, and you can't go to court and say, well, somebody else is doing it, therefore I'm legal in doing it. But I'll give you one very practical example that's close to this conference and to my heart, Zimbabwe. Last year around this time, after there was a brutal attack on the opposition in the capital city, Harare, the leader of the Catholic Church, Archbishop Ube, invited some of us to come to a defiance prayer rally. And driving into Bulawayo, which, by the way, it's the second city of Zimbabwe, and the literal translation of Bulawayo is the place where you get murdered. So my family wasn't particularly happy about me making this trip. But anyway, but it was such a sense of deja vu, like apartheid South Africa times, you know, army, water cannons, tanks, and so on. I was followed by two intelligence agents during the time that I was there, and eventually, towards the end of the trip, I just kind of went up to them, gave them my card, and said, you know, let's just have a chat. And one of the things they said was, you know, we are not as bad as. We are not doing rendition, which I think everybody knows what it is. We are not running Guantanamo Bay. We have not gone to another country and tortured, you know, large numbers of people in Abu Ghraib and so on. And, you know, what it's doing, it's giving justification. And the other sad thing is, when a country like Ethiopia is on the right side of this war on terror because of Somalia, you can have violations happening and nobody picks up their voice to actually speak because they are so, and the Cold War logic in some ways still prevails, which is you might be a son of a bitch, but if you're our son of a bitch, it's okay. By the way, that's not my words, that's a word of President Roosevelt speaking in with regard to Somoza in Nicaragua. So I think what implications for you? I think your implications are support human rights work, but don't only think about supporting human rights work in the South. And I might get killed by some of my colleagues in the African and civil society community for saying, you know, telling American foundations, look at funding organizations here in the US that are actually doing work to hold the US government accountable to the standards by which it actually preaches. Because the problem we have is there's a compliance deficit. Many governments are saying the right things in policy terms. If you go and look at the African Union, in terms of what we say about human rights, what we say on democracy, it's as good as what the European Union says. And so the difficulty is we must not let any government, however strong, to not comply by what the citizens have told them to comply by, and that will help us in the other parts of the world to holding our own governments accountable.
And we have a question back here, the gentleman with the glasses.
Thank you. Patrick Alley, Global Witness. I want to answer a question and ask one. In terms of an effective network working on these issues, I think the single most effective network on the issue of good governance is the Publish What You Pay NGO coalition. It was co-founded by Transparency International, Save the Children Fund, Oxfam, George Soros, and ourselves. It's 300 strong, mainly in the South. It holds government to account, particularly over natural resource revenues. It was Publish What You Pay that led to the creation of the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. Publish What You Pay members train other Publish What You Pay members in the countries that they're working in. And when, as often happens, local civil society activists get targeted by their governments, publish what you pay has influence, it leaps in, and it helps really fast. So that's, I would commend you to Google and look at them. It's a very effective network. My question is to Mr. Amoako. You talked about Liberia. One issue that happened there was Mittal Steel making a $900 million investment with a very bad contract with the transitional government of Liberia before Ellen Johnson Sirleaf came to power. But it highlights a bigger issue, which is that Lakshmi Mittal's personal wealth is 295 times greater than the budget of Liberia. He can afford better lawyers. And very often countries rich in resources in Africa don't know the value of their resources, and they don't want to frighten off the investors, so they do bad deals. So I think my question is there a way that countries, that philanthropists, that someone can get together to create a forum whereby if a country's got something to sell, it can get advice on what it's worth and how to do it?
Let me answer that with another practical example. In my own country, Ghana, now, that we're facing an issue, and perhaps we can use that as a model of how we can cope. You know, Ghana has discovered significant quantities of oil. And we really don't know, and it could be a lot. So there's a lot of excitement in the country, naturally. But at the very outset, some of us then went to the president and said, look, you know, this could be a real blessing. It could also be a curse. So how do we ensure that it becomes a blessing and not a curse? And what we need to do is to learn from the lessons of other countries, especially the bad cases, and what to avoid. So we did have a 4-day national seminar where we brought in people from Norway, the World Bank, Nigeria, Gabon, Venezuela, to really talk through this issue of how is Ghana going to exploit these natural resources for long-term economic growth and sustainability and avoid these challenges. We have members of parliament there. We had the whole cabinet. The president spent the whole day there. Okay? So there, and we had people from Nigeria making presentations about what went wrong in Nigeria. So, and one of the key issues, basically the type of hydrocarbon law that you put in place, the type of concessions you give, how you negotiate with these international companies so as to get the best returns for the country. These are the practical issues. So right now, as I speak, the report of that conference on the burden strategy, which I'm supposed to help as a strategic advisor of my center in terms of implementing this, is being taken around the regions of Ghana for participation. The chiefs are being brought in, especially those regions, those parts of the country.
How is all this funded?
Pardon?
How is all this being funded? By the government?
By the government. I think the Norwegian government also brought in some money. I think a few things like that. And the World Bank and all that. Yeah, but it tells you a classic case. So as we move towards the implementation of this strategy, the point is that perhaps we can link up with some of you who can provide some of in specific areas, bringing the necessary expertise very, very on in this game to ensure that at least we implement a strategy that draws upon the lessons from other countries. So I very much, and in the case of Mittal Steel, you know, and I mean, I want to link this to the SME issue. One of the things we did for Liberia is I had a cabinet retreat, Johnson invited, and we made a presentation to the cabinet, drawing lessons from Rwanda and Mozambique as to how Liberia can go through its reconstruction and development process by learning from these two African countries that have also come out of conflict and all that. And one of the things we realized from Mozambique is there's been a lot of capital-intensive mega projects gone in there. But they have created hardly any jobs.
Really?
For the people, yeah. Because they are very capital-intensive. Yeah, okay. And the agricultural sector in particular, productivity is very, very low. So again, also you do have so if you have these huge natural resource programs and you're not very, very careful, you're going to destroy your other sectors like agriculture and all that. So those are some of the lessons that I think we need to draw from other countries. So that would be my
It's a really good example, though, of how you can do something and maybe get funding from a philanthropy that helps.
To help, yeah.
Yes, there's a question over here. The gentleman whose hand's up right there.
Thanks. I'm Bruce Shearer with Magis Americas. Excuse me. You know, the whole problem of good governance, as you put it earlier, Kumi, requires the global level as well as the national levels. And we have many institutions like the UN, the World Bank, the IMF, that serve governments, serve states. Civil society is very fragmented, so there are tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions of NGOs. Your organization is one that tries to bring us all together at a global level to give us voice in this partnership with the institutions of the state. World Economic Forum tries to give voice to corporations in that sector at the global level. What's happening, in your opinion, in this effort for us to have a voice at the global level? How's the World Social Forum doing? How's CIVICUS doing? Are you getting representation for us at the UN? Are you fighting the World Bank at some representational level for our sector?
Very briefly, with regard to the World Bank, when President Wolfenson was there, we had made quite a lot of progress to open up space for the World Bank in its activities to engage with civil society at the global level, but also at the country level. Some of that is still happening, but when Wolfenson was followed by the other Wolfowitz, and so on, there's been a little bit of a slippage, but in principle, I think that the space is there. But sadly, you know, a lot of civil society organizations are coming to the conclusion when they do a cost-benefit analysis of how much of energies they should put into trying to influence the World Bank at a global level. They are now beginning to actually see, well, actually maybe it's not the best use of time. With the United Nations, we lobbied as CIVICUS very hard for Kofi Annan to do a review of how the UN engages with civil society. The President of Brazil, former President Cardoso, chaired a panel. There was a really good set of recommendations that came out, which are now very, very, very slowly being implemented within the UN system. So any support to actually push that, I think, would be helpful. But overall, I think what we are seeing is that governments are reaching out or opening up at the global level for civil society to engage for a range of different reasons. So for example, when the WTO negotiations happens, the World Trade Organization, what you're seeing these days, Bruce, is that some African country delegations or even from Asia are including NGO people on their delegations to that formal negotiations, because sometimes there's more trade negotiating competency to be found within NGOs rather than in small governments. The one thing I should say that I think the civil society as collectively has pushed is to say that to think out of the box. Like in Africa last year, in Accra, Ghana, there was, at the annual meeting of the African Union, which is all the African states, there was the banner across the hall said, "Towards a union government for Africa," with the idea of almost beginning a conversation of moving towards a sort of union of African states. And the point you made earlier, in Africa we've got all these very small, unviable states. So I think one of the contributions that civil society is making is saying things and putting visions that governments are not able to actually put them. To end on a light note, I've, for about 10 years now, been saying to African governments that if Europe can have a euro, I don't see why Africa can't have an afro.
Okay, we have time for two more questions. And by the way, do not get up and leave or even think about leaving, because there's a great panel after this and a very important panel, and it's going to happen right when we're done. Yes, let's see. There's a lady with her hand up right there.
Like that. Anne Cotton, CAMFED. And I just want to thank you for bringing in the international dimension to this. I work in Africa, and just to give a couple of anecdotes, I was listening to Paul Collier at the UN last week, and he said that the total royalties from mining companies in the year before last in the Democratic Republic of Congo was $86,000, the total. now going into the public purse. Now, that must be a major factor of that must be the collusion of the corporations. We were asked in Zimbabwe to support 2 children by a mining company, an international mining company. The question is, why, when people are fully employed as mine workers, they are not able to send their children to school? That's the reality. We just out of interest looked at their materials. A former senior politician in the UK was in fact on their board. That very government that was actually instrumental in funding jeeps, calling it aid to Zimbabwe in advance and expectation of trouble. So I think, there is a place for us to be incredibly vigilant internationally in our own countries and to share information when we find it on the ground, because it is actually really disempowering countries and really adding to the insecurity globally. Thank you.
And one last question. And please say who your question is for. Yes, here.
Hi, my name is Sean Blagsmith. I work at babajob.com. My question is simple. What are the lessons that we can learn historically from other countries that have successfully fought corruption?
Do you have this?
Anyone can take it.
Okay, Ashraf Ghani, why don't you go ahead?
Sure. Well, take Singapore. Singapore of 1965 was extremely corrupt. Today, it's much cleaner than almost all European countries in the United States and North America, other than the Scandinavian. It matches them. What did they do? They began from the top down. They didn't go after small corruption. They went after big corruption first. Second, they put systems in place, not charismatic leadership. Thirdly, they went after ministers. 3 Singaporean ministers, one of them committed suicide, 2 were disgraced. And fourth, the rule of law was enforced regardless of the person affected. Because of that, now you can have a contract awarded within 1 week in Singapore, and there won't be a single question regarding integrity. Take Port of Dubai. Dubai Port is managing 42 ports. In one example, in Africa, Djibouti, a model was brought about where they actually shared revenues with the government, and it brought about $500 million of investment. These are types of examples, but the most significant one is really the United States itself. If you take Lincoln Stephanus' work, Shame of the Cities, there's nothing on anti-corruption that still tops it, because he documents city after city what the cost of corruption was. And it took a social movement here. If you remember, Teddy Roosevelt began running as the commissioner of police and went up. The biography of Lincoln Stephanus and his book, Shame of the Cities, are probably still 2. 2 issues need to be differentiated. One, what's the playing field? Because we often focus on corruption as an individual level, saying the abuse of public office for personal gain. But the field, and if the field is crooked, then it's a different type of corruption. An example, American food. $2 billion a year is spent supporting global fight against hunger. 65% of this is cost of administration and transportation, because the rules are made in such a way that makes it extremely expensive. This type of rule writing where interests enter. And this is the point to build on the earlier example regarding DRC. It's extremely significant. Corporations manage to write the rules for extractive industry in a way they're all in charge. And the answer in part is again the convening power of this group. Because what you can bring in the way of support for the poorest countries of the world to be part of the discussion with the corporate sector and with the finance sector, and to bring that knowledge in addition to your money, your knowledge is really key. So your convening power is enormous in this regard and could be put to good use.
Ashraf Ghani, Kumi Naidoo, KY Amoako, thank you. Please join me in thanking our panelists.